Friday night. Evan's apartment in Denver. 4th floor, Lodo. The balcony faced east toward the Platte River and the old rail yards. And when the city was quiet enough, you could almost hear the trains that didn't run there anymore. Just the sense of them. Something iron and purposeful in the air. He'd been standing out there for 20 minutes with his phone in his hand and his beer going flat on the railing and the city lights doing what city lights do on a clear night in March, pretending the distance is smaller than it is. He'd called Scott at 8:43. He'd told him about the permit delay, the structural review that had come back with 3 red flags, 2 cosmetic, 1 real, the museum project, his project, the thing he'd spent 12 years building toward, had hit a wall that was probably 10 weeks wide and felt at 8:43 on a Friday, like it was made of something permanent. Scott had listened. Scott was good at listening. And then, before Scott said a word, there was a half second. Not silence. Not the pause of a man choosing how to comfort a friend. Something else. A small acoustic thing. A particular quality of air moving through a phone line before language arrives. Evan had heard it and not heard it at the same time. The way you notice a smell in a room and then convince yourself there's nothing there. Then Scott said,
Man, that sucks. I'm so sorry. You've been working toward this for so long. What does this actually mean for the timeline?
Evan told him Scott said the right things. Sympathetic, practical, genuinely present. The kind of friend you call at 8:43 on a Friday because he picks up and he means it. That was what Evan believed. Standing on the balcony with the flat beer and the city lights, in the half second he was already trying to talk himself out of. He set the phone on the railing, picked up the beer, looked at the river.
That half second. What was that?
He said it quietly, to himself, to no one. He didn't have an answer. He'd known Scott Mercer for 15 years, since junior year at Colorado State, since the studio class where they'd spent 3 weeks arguing about a bridge project and become, by the end of it, the kind of friends who don't have to explain what they mean. He knew Scott's voice the way you know the sounds of a building you live in, the creaks that mean settling, the hum that means the furnace, the specific silence that means everything is fine. He picked up the beer, put it down without drinking. Before Scott said a word, he tried to name what had been in that half second and couldn't. So he stood there, east-facing, watching the city that had no idea he was watching it and let the question sit. He was good at questions. That was the thing he'd built a career on, the ability to hold a problem without forcing it to resolve before it was ready. He just hadn't expected to be applying that skill to his oldest friend. His name was Evan Calloway, 39 years old. Architect. Solo practice, 2 years running. He'd spent 12 years before that at 3 different firms. The first in Boulder, small, good training. The second in Chicago, politically complicated, the kind of place where talent was rewarded slowly and credit distributed unevenly. The third back in Denver, where he developed a reputation as the guy who could take a client's half-formed idea and turn it into something real without losing what had been interesting about it in the first place. He was good. He knew he was good. He'd spent a fair amount of his 30s not saying that out loud and then slowly learning that the difference between confidence and arrogance was what you did with the knowledge. In October, he'd entered the competition for the Overland Regional Museum renovation. 12,000 square feet, significant budget, 3 years of work if he won. He entered alone. No firm behind him, no senior partner to put his name on the proposal. Just Evan Calloway, solo practice, with a portfolio and an argument for why his approach was different from the 4 other firms bidding. He'd won. He still thought about the day the letter arrived. How he'd sat in his car in the parking lot of the coffee shop where he'd opened the email, hands flat on his steering wheel, reading it twice, 3 times. How 12 years of patient, disciplined work had reorganized itself into this one moment, and the moment was quiet and enormous and his entirely. He'd called Scott first. Scott Mercer, 41, marketing executive at a healthcare firm downtown. Wife Hannah, a boy Cooper, just turned 5. A house in Washington Park with a garden Hannah kept beautifully. In every visible sense, doing well, good life. The kind of life that reads clearly from the outside as a success. They'd met junior year, the bridge project, the studio class, 3 weeks of arguing about tensile strength and aesthetic vocabulary, and whether function could be beautiful without intending to be. By the end of the 3 weeks, they were finishing each other's sentences and had made plans to get beers on a Thursday that became a weekly thing that lasted 2 years. After graduation, they'd gone different directions. Scott into the corporate track, marketing for a tech startup, then healthcare, the kind of career that was sensible and scalable, and Evan had always privately thought not quite what Scott had been built for. Scott was smart in the way that architects are smart. Spatial, pattern-oriented, the kind of thinking that belongs to people who can hold a 3-dimensional object in their head and rotate it without losing it. He'd gone into marketing instead. Evan had never asked him about that directly. It felt like territory you didn't enter without being invited. Scott never mentioned it. When Evan's career was going well, Scott was the first person to celebrate it. Loud, genuine, the kind of friend who told other people about your accomplishments before you did. He'd introduce Evan at parties with a kind of proprietary pride. This guy just got the Larimer Commission. I've been saying he was going to blow up since 2009. 15 years. The kind of friendship that had accumulated enough weight that Evan stopped examining it the way he would have at 25. Stopped testing whether the foundation was still solid. You don't test the foundation of a house you've lived in for 15 years. You just live in it. The night Evan called him about winning the museum project, he remembered it clearly. The parking lot. The open email. He'd sat there for maybe 2 minutes before reaching for his phone. He could have called Marcus, his closest friend from his Chicago years. He'd called Scott. Scott had picked up on the second ring.
Hey, what's up?
I won.
He'd said it simply, just those 2 words, and waited. There was a pause. Not long. Half a second maybe. The specific pause before the words. And then Scott said,
Dude, are you serious? The museum project?
Yeah.
Evan, come on, man. That's incredible. I knew it. I knew they were going to pick you. I've been telling people this.
His voice had warmed immediately. Genuine warmth, the kind Evan recognized after 15 years. He asked questions. What was the scope? When did the work start? How was Evan feeling? He laughed when Evan described reading the email 3 times. He said, "Dude, again," which was what he said when he meant something. Evan remembered sitting in the parking lot, the phone getting warm against his face, feeling the wind become more real because Scott knew about it now. That was the thing about telling the right person. It made the thing more solid. He hadn't thought about the pause. He'd had no reason to. He did think about it now. Standing on the balcony 3 months later with a different pause sitting in the same room in his memory. He thought, was it there both times? He went inside, rinsed the beer bottle, stood in his kitchen, a small, well-organized space he'd renovated himself 2 years ago, and tried to remember other moments. And then, Aside 다르가 치키va 에르va sits the titrate. A pajestini carding now making. Oh, the problem was that the moments examined now were ambiguous. Scott had been 40 minutes late to the dinner Evan had organized to celebrate the museum win. Hannah was there. Marcus was there. He'd flown in from Chicago just for the weekend. 2 other friends. Scott had arrived already apologizing. Something about traffic, a thing at work. He'd hugged Evan at the door. The hug was warm. And there was a moment, a fraction, where something moved across his face before the smile finished forming. Evan stood in his kitchen and thought, I noticed that, I noticed it, and I didn't notice it. He thought about the other moments. The client call that had gone badly in December. A residential remodel, a client who disputed the billing. Evan had vented to Scott in a text thread on a Wednesday evening. Scott had called the next morning, not texted, called, 8:15 a.m.
Hey, I've been thinking about you. How are you doing? That old client situation, that was rough.
Evan had appreciated it, but later, just a day or two, Scott doesn't usually call. Scott texts. They'd had a long-running joke about it. Evan was a caller, Scott was a texter, and the friendship had learned to live in the gap between those preferences. He'd called 8:15, the morning after Evan's bad week.
How did he know it was a call situation? I texted. I hadn't communicated it was that bad.
He thought maybe he just knew. 15 years. He thought maybe. He went to bed still thinking it. He tried to sleep. The building's HVAC made the sound it made. A low, consistent hum with a slightly irregular rhythm, like a machine that was almost perfectly calibrated. He'd lived with it for 2 years, and it was part of the texture of the place. He lay there with the half second before Scott said a word. Not the words themselves. The words were right. Measured, present, neither catastrophizing nor dismissing. Scott was good at that. But the half second was before the words. It existed before Scott decided what to say, before the warmth arrived. In the gap between receiving the information and choosing the response, something had moved.
I'm reading into it. You can't hear a half second of phone silence and build a case out of it.
He thought about a phrase his sister used. You're a pattern person. You find patterns even when they're not there. She'd meant it affectionately. It was still true. He rolled over. The HVAC hummed. He told himself to sleep. The lunch with Victor happened on a Tuesday in February. Victor Pena was 62. He'd been practicing architecture for 35 years. Large civic projects, public work, the kind of career built so slowly and solidly that it had the quality of infrastructure rather than achievement. He'd been Evan's studio professor at Colorado State, and then, 2 years after graduation, had run into him at a conference and said, with the exact specificity Evan had always respected in him, I heard about the Larimer project. You made one mistake. The east facade wasn't yours, was it? It wasn't. He'd been overruled by a senior partner. Victor had nodded, said, fix that the next time. That was the whole conversation. Evan had carried it for years. They went to a place on Blake Street that Victor liked. Good soup, no ambient music. He hated ambient music in restaurants. They talked about the museum project first. Victor had dealt with something similar on a civic library project in the 90s. He walked Evan through how he'd handled it, without softening the parts that hadn't worked. Then, over the soup, Victor said,
You've got something else on your mind.
Evan looked at him.
Is it that obvious?
You're an architect. You don't leave dead space in a structure, and you don't leave it in a conversation. There's something you're organizing up there.
Evan told him, not dramatically, the phone call, the Friday night, the permit news, and the half second before Scott said it was rough. Victor ate his soup, said nothing for a moment. Evan had learned over the years of these lunches that the silences were part of how Victor thought. Evan went further. The dinner when Scott was late, the face before the smile, the December call after the bad client situation, how Scott had crossed his own habits, how he'd been the first person Evan heard from.
When you've had good news. Where's Scott?
The question landed with the precision of a very good question.
He's there. He comes. He said the right things when I got the museum project. Present. Or present.
Evan was quiet.
What do you mean?
There's present. Your body is in the room. You say the words. And then there's present, meaning you're actually there. The thing that lights up when something good happens to someone you love. That specific quality. Was that there?
Evan picked up his coffee, put it down.
The dinner. He was 40 minutes late to the dinner.
When you had a bad week in December.
He called. First. Before anyone else.
You've known this man for how long? 15 years.
And in 15 years.
When things went badly for you, where was Scott?
Evan sat with that. They haven't no use source you could do you in. A claw like holder. A baguette the boy use over the way.
He was there. He was always there.
How quickly?
Faster than most people. And when things went well?
Evan looked at the table.
He would come. Eventually. He'd say the right things. He was always a little slower to arrive.
He heard what he was saying as he was saying it.
I sound like I'm building a case.
You're describing a pattern. A case is what you decide to do with it next.
Victor put down his spoon and looked at Evan with the expression he used when he was going to say something precise, and then leave it where it landed.
You said before he said a word. You said there was a half second when you told him the permit review had gone badly.
Yeah.
Describe the half second.
It was before the words. Before he said, "That sucks, man." In the gap between me finishing and him starting, there was something. I don't know how to name it. A quality of air. An exhale, maybe. Something that wasn't grief. Wasn't shock.
What was it?
Evan thought about it carefully.
It sounded like someone sitting back. Like something landing softly. Not concern. Not the sound of a man absorbing bad news. Something more like something confirmed. Like a thing he'd suspected and now had evidence for.
Relief.
Yeah, too strong a word maybe, but something in that direction.
Victor was quiet for a moment.
Jung called it the shadow. Not Scott's shadow of you. Scott's shadow of himself. The collection of everything he hasn't been able to accept about his own life.
Evan looked at him.
Every time you succeed, it costs Scott something. Not consciously. He probably doesn't know this is happening. But you and Scott started from the same place. Same school, same training, same possibilities at 22. You chose one path, he chose another. His path is safe, stable, good. And somewhere inside him, somewhere he cannot look directly at, is the question he can never answer. Was I wrong?
Scott's done well. His life is...
Materially, yes. I'm not talking about materially. I'm talking about the specific pain of watching someone from your starting line do the thing you told yourself you couldn't do. The older you get, the more specific that pain becomes.
Evan didn't say anything.
There's a German word for what you heard in that half second. Schadenfreude. Pleasure in another person's misfortune. It has a bad reputation. People think it means you're cruel. But the neuroscience is more interesting than that. Studies with brain imaging show that when someone experiences a setback, the people who secretly envy them, not openly, secretly, show activation in the brain's reward circuitry. Dopamine. A flash. Before they've even assembled a conscious response.
Like the body responding before the person decides to.
Exactly. Before the mask goes on. Before the, "that sucks, man," there's a flash. And what you heard in that half second was the flash. Your nervous system read it before you had a name for it.
Evan was quiet for a long moment.
That's a significant thing to say about someone. About 15 years.
It is. And I could be completely wrong.
You could.
But the pattern you're describing, faster presence in the bad moments, slower presence in the good ones, that's not random. That's structural. And the face you almost saw at the dinner, the half second on the phone, those are your nervous system reading something that your reasoning mind was too loyal to confirm.
He's been my friend for 15 years.
I know. And he probably has been in the way he's capable of being. What I'm telling you is that his capacity for it has a ceiling, defined by the thing he never resolved about his own life.
Victor picked his spoon back up. The soup was probably cold. He ate it anyway.
The man who laughs at you behind your back isn't free, Evan. He's doing it from a place of such profound internal conflict that your success is genuinely threatening to his architecture. The story he's built about why his life went the way it went. You threaten that story every time you win.
So what do I do with it? Nothing dramatic. You don't confront it. You adjust what you give access to.
What do you mean? You choose who you celebrate with. You choose who you share the work with while it's still warm. You don't owe anyone the inside of your progress just because they've always been in the room.
He said it simply, like something that didn't require much weight to land.
That feels like losing something. You're not losing the friendship. You're adjusting its function. There's a version of Scott that's real. The guy who'd help you move furniture, who shows up for the hard stuff in the straightforward ways. That Scott is probably genuine. But the Scott you've been inviting into the successes, the one you've been handing a front row seat to the life he chose not to build, that version isn't receiving something clean, and you haven't been getting back what you thought you were.
Evan sat with that. He thought about the 15 years. All the ways Scott had been present. The years in Chicago when they'd stayed close at a distance. The calls that got them through the hard patches of their 30s. Real things. Real history. He also thought about the dinner. The 40 minutes. The face. He thought, I knew something, and I didn't know what to do with it. The bookstore was in Capitol Hill, one of those independent places that had survived by becoming indispensable. Events, a good staff recommendations section, the kind of warmth a building earns by deciding what it's for. He was there on a Saturday in late February looking for a technical book on structural concrete. He had a list. He was efficient about it. He was at the architecture section when he heard his name.
Evan. Oh my god, hi.
Kira Ose. He turned around. He hadn't seen her in almost a year. She was passing through Denver. She lived in Portland now, worked in urban planning, She had the settled quality of someone who'd gotten where they were going. They stood in the aisle and talked for 20 minutes the way people do who have enough history to skip the small talk, but not so much that it becomes heavy. And then she said, quickly, casually, without registering any particular significance.
Oh, speaking of, I saw the thing Scott posted in the group chat. About your project. Is the permit situation that stressful? He made it sound like it might be a real problem.
Evan looked at her.
What group chat?
The Colorado State one, the architecture people. You're not in it?
No. I didn't know there was one.
Oh. I just assumed maybe you left it? Anyway, he mentioned the permit review. Said something like Evan's project is hitting some serious walls. Might be a tough year for him. Not in a mean way. He put a sad face. He seemed genuinely worried.
Naturally, where's in the mathware though? Sometime, the other was proback the ways, minor information exchange. 5 seconds. Barely worth noting. Evan stood in the bookstore aisle. He had told Scott about the permit delay on Friday night. A call at 8:43. By the following week, Scott had taken that information. In a group Evan wasn't part of. A group Evan had apparently never been added to, and made it available to an audience. He'd given it a frame, serious walls, tough year. He'd attached an emotion, worry, a sad face. Evan thought he made it sound worse than I said it was. He thought he shared this without asking me. He thought, why does he know a group chat I'm not in? That last question sat differently than the others. Kira was saying something about Portland now. He nodded, said the right things. She had to get back. They hugged. She left. He stood in the architecture section for a moment, the technical book in his hand. Before Scott said a word, he thought about what came before the word, now that he had more of the sentence. Scott hadn't just heard the news and felt the flash. He carried the news somewhere else. He'd found an audience for it. He'd framed Evan's difficulty, put it into a group context, surrounded it with concern that from the outside looked exactly like friendship. Kashern refische du ini historis don in our shape. The courts was korpoit, you know? The kadening yumi above, shasa fagrost, which a one angler tried man on. K, captional cried. That was the architecture of it. You couldn't point to anything. He was worried. He'd said so. There was a sad face. He paid for the book, walked out into the February cold, stood on the sidewalk. He texted Victor. Something just happened. Can we talk? Victor replied in his style. A single line, no punctuation. Tomorrow morning, 8, call me. He called at 8, told Victor about Kira, the bookstore, the group chat he hadn't known existed. Victor was quiet for a moment.
He made it public. Not publicly. It's a closed group.
He made it available to an audience without checking with you.
He said he was worried. Put a sad emoji.
Victor was quiet again.
What did Jung call it? Projection of the shadow. The man who can't look at his own failures needs a container for the feeling. Your struggles serve a function for him. They're not just information, they're relief. And relief, when it's strong enough, wants to be shared. Wants a witness.
He framed it as worry.
Of course he did. He framed it to himself that way too, probably. That's the shadow. The person genuinely doesn't know the difference between what they feel and what they're performing. Scott probably believes he's worried about you. And underneath the belief, the relief is moving around like a current he doesn't have a name for.
I feel like I'm making him into a villain.
You're not. He's not a villain. He's a man who made a choice 20 years ago and built a life on it and can't afford to question it. So every piece of evidence that the alternative was possible is a threat. That's not evil. That's a person in pain who hasn't found a way to sit with the pain directly. So it leaks. In half seconds. In group chats. In the speed of his arrival when your luck goes wrong.
And I've been giving him a front row seat.
You shared your wins with someone who couldn't celebrate them cleanly. That's not your failure. You were operating on 15 years of data that looked like friendship and mostly was. The problem isn't that you trusted him. The problem is that you trusted him with something his own architecture couldn't hold.
How do you know the difference going forward? How do you actually read who's real and who isn't?
Victor made the sound he made when a question entered in. A short, dry intake of breath.
You said there was a half second before he said it was rough. Before the words.
Yeah, and at the dinner. Before the smile.
Something passed across his face.
The body reads before the mind decides. It's been reading this longer than you've been aware. You read it both times. You read it correctly. You just didn't have the language for what you were reading. The loyalty instinct gave it other explanations.
That's the sign, Evan. Not what they say, not how they present. The half second before they say it, in the gap that exists before the decision, that's where you'll find what's actually there.
He didn't call Scott for a while after that. Not a dramatic break. Not a confrontation. He didn't send a message. Didn't explain. Didn't stage the kind of painful, revelatory conversation that lives in movies and almost never in real life. He just adjusted. He noticed the habit first. Good news came in. First call. Scott. Project update worth celebrating. First text. Scott. He'd been routing his wins through a particular person for 15 years. He stopped doing that. It wasn't a goodbye. Scott still existed in the friendship's logistical layer. They texted. They made plans that sometimes materialized. Evan still liked the guy in most of the ways you like someone you've known for 15 years. The easy conversation. The shared reference bank. The furniture moving Scott. The show up at the hospital Scott. That version was real. But the inside seat, the front row, the first call, the news that mattered most while it was still warm, he started redirecting that. Not to anyone in particular at first, just not there. He sat with what Victor had said about the shadow. The man who laughs behind your back is not free. He'd thought about that in the week after the call. Carried it through the work, through the permit process, through the revised structural assessment. Scott hadn't chosen to be this, hadn't woken up at 41 and decided to build a friendship on ambiguous foundations. He'd taken the safe path at 22, probably for reasons that felt solid then. Security, certainty, the plan that made sense when the alternative felt like a risk you couldn't afford. He'd been a good version of the person that path allowed him to be, and every year that Evan stayed on the riskier path, every win that confirmed the road not taken was actually passable. It cost Scott something. You don't choose that cost. It accrues. He dealt with the permit delay. 3 weeks, not 10. The structural issue turned out to have a solution that was cleaner than the initial assessment had suggested. The museum project moved forward. He didn't call Scott when he found out. April. A Thursday evening. He was on the balcony again. Same spot. East facing. The Platte, somewhere in the dark below the lights. He texted Marcus that afternoon. Marcus lived in Chicago, was in tech now. Product management at a company Evan found genuinely interesting whenever Marcus described it. They talked less than they should. The way people do when the friendship is solid enough to afford the intervals. He texted, museum project back on track. Big movement today. needed to tell someone. Marcus had called in 4 minutes.
Dude, wait. Back on track how? Tell me everything. What happened?
Evan had told him the permit resolution, the structural solution, what it meant for the timeline. And before Marcus said a word, before he'd even finished absorbing the information, before the conscious response had time to assemble, something had moved across the call. Not a half second of air moving before performance. Something else. An immediate, involuntary sound. Short. An exhale of pleasure. The kind that arrives before you've decided to be pleased because you are pleased. Because it's good news. And it landed before the reasoning caught up with the feeling. Before Marcus said anything, the face had already answered.
Yeah? Dude! Yes! Evan, come on! That's... okay. Okay. I knew that structural thing was going to resolve. How's the timeline looking now?
He laughed. Marcus had asked 3 more questions, each one coming from inside genuine interest rather than the shape of interest. He asked what the timeline looked like now, whether the structural solution would change the budget, whether Evan was going to actually celebrate or just work through the weekend.
You can't work through the weekend. That's not allowed.
It's a museum. I'm going to work through the weekend.
I figured, but I said it for the record.
The call had lasted 38 minutes. Evan stood on the balcony afterward in the same spot where he'd stood in March with the flat beer and the half second that didn't have a name yet. He thought about the 2 phone calls, the specific quality of the silence before each man's first word. One silence was a gap, space between receiving something and deciding what to do with it. The time a person needs to assemble the right expression, to close the window of the actual reaction and open the window of the appropriate one. The time the mask takes to go on. The other silence was almost no silence at all. Just the news hitting and the body responding before anything had been chosen. The sound of someone actually there. Before Marcus said a word, his face had already answered. Evan stood with the city lights doing what they did on a clear night, pretending the distance smaller than it was, and felt something that took a moment to identify. Not relief, exactly. Not grief. Something more like orientation. The sensation of knowing where you are after a period of being uncertain about it. He thought about what Victor had told him. The body reads before the mind decides. You read it correctly, you just didn't have the language yet. He had the language now. Schadenfreude. The German word for a very specific kind of joy. The joy that lives at the expense of someone else's difficulty. Not chosen, not performed. A flash, a dopamine response in the gap before the mask goes on. Neuroscientists had measured it. Jung had named the mechanism underneath it. The shadow, the container of everything a person can't admit about themselves. What they project onto the people whose lives make their own lives more difficult to defend. He'd tantamount Scott what he was carrying. The choice at 22 that had calcified into the story of a life, and every piece of evidence that challenged that story was a wound. Evan didn't hate him for it. He felt something more complex, a kind of sad clarity. 15 years of friendship contained more real things than not, and also contained this. Both were true. Neither canceled the other. He thought about the sign, the one the story had delivered, not as a rule, but as an experience. Your body knows before you've decided to know. The half second before the words is where the truth lives. He thought about how long he'd been explaining away that gap. The loyalty instinct, the 15-year wait, the reasonable explanations. Scott's busy, Scott's processing differently. You're a pattern person, and sometimes you find patterns where they aren't. all reasonable, all, on occasion, true about other things. But not about this. Not about the half-second. He went back inside, made tea, sat at his drafting table with the museum plans. Scott wasn't watching himself laugh behind Evan's back. He was laughing in a language he didn't know he spoke. He texted Victor one more time in April. Told Marcus today. Museum's back on track. He knew before I finished the sentence. Victor replied in his style. 6 words. That's what real looks like. Evan read it, set his phone down, looked at the museum plans spread across the drafting table. The east facade was his this time. Entirely. No senior partner to overrule him. No compromise baked into the design by someone else's authority. Just the solution the space required. He went back to work. He still saw Scott. The friendship didn't end. It settled into what it actually was, which was something real but smaller than Evan had been treating it. Smaller in a way that made it fit better. They watched a game in November. Met for beers twice in the spring. Scott was still good at the things he'd always been good at. The broad conversation, the easy company, the specific way he laughed at the kind of joke that required a shared reference. Evan didn't volunteer the work anymore. He didn't route the winds through him. He didn't hand him the front row seat. He didn't explain this to Scott. There was nothing to explain. The friendship was still there, just honest now about what it could hold and what it couldn't. Once, in November, Scott asked how the museum was going. He asked the way people ask, casually, between other things. Evan said, "It's going well, moving fast." He watched Scott's face. Something moved across it. Quick, reorganizing.
That's great. You deserve it, man.
He said it warmly. He probably meant it in the way he was capable of meaning it. Evan nodded, said thanks, changed the subject. He noticed the half-second. He no longer needed to examine it. He just knew what was in it. Before Scott said a word, that was the sign Jung recognized. Not the words people choose, not the expression they assemble in the half-second after they've received your news. Before all of that, in the gap that exists before the decision, is where the truth lives. Your body reads it. Your nervous system has been reading it for years, accumulating the data point by point, building the case that your reasoning mind was too loyal to close. The slight delay before the congratulations, the suspicious speed of the condolences, the quality of the listening that's different when the news is good versus when the news is bad, the face that's still organizing itself when you look up too fast. You have not been imagining it. What you've been doing is explaining it away, giving the 15-year wait more authority than the half-second truth, being loyal to the story of the friendship rather than to what the friendship was actually doing. And the other side of that sign, the people who celebrate you when things go right, immediately, without needing to process it first. That quality of their arrival is also real. The face that already answered before the words came. The voice that responded before it had time to be careful. That's not nothing. That's the whole thing. Learn to feel the difference. Not as a formula you apply to every friendship you have, as a calibration, a return to the instrument you were born with, the one that was reading the room before you had the language to describe what it was reading. Your instincts have been right more often than you've given them credit for. The question was never whether you could trust what you felt. The question was whether you were willing to